You know the Christmas story. Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem for a census. Jesus is born in a stable. Shepherds and wise men show up to worship. Except here's the thing. The two versions of this story in the Bible contradict each other in ways that are impossible to reconcile. And that Roman census Luke talks about, it happened 10 years too late. Today, we're treating the Nativity like a cold case. So I want to talk about something that might seem unusual for this podcast, but this is legitimately one of the most interesting historical mysteries I've ever dug into. We're talking about the birth of Jesus. Before anybody gets nervous, this isn't about faith or theology. I am a believer. This is about what happens when you treat one of the most famous events in human history like a cold case investigation. What do we actually know? What can we prove? And where do the stories fall apart? The two accounts of Jesus' birth in the Bible, Matthew and Luke, contradict each other in fundamental ways that you can't really reconcile. Scholars have been trying for centuries. In Matthew, Mary and Joseph are living in Bethlehem. Jesus is born there. Magi show up, following a star, and go to King Herod asking where the new king of the Jews has been born. Herod freaks out, learns it's Bethlehem, and sends them there. They worship the kid, get warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, and bail. Joseph gets his own warning, grabs his family, and they flee to Egypt. They stay until Herod dies, then relocate to Nazareth. Luke's version is different. Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. Emperor Augustus orders a massive census. Everyone has to go to their ancestral hometown to register. Joseph is descended from King David, whose hometown was Bethlehem, so they travel there. Mary is pregnant. They make this 150-kilometer journey. Jesus is born in a stable. Shepherds show up. The family goes to Jerusalem to present Jesus to the temple. Then they go right back to Nazareth. You see the problem? In Matthew, they start in Bethlehem and end up in Nazareth, running from a murderous king. In Luke, they start in Nazareth, take a quick trip to Bethlehem, and go right back. These are two completely different stories, and they both can't be true at the same time. Scholars have known this forever. What they figured out is both writers had a problem to solve. Everybody knew Jesus was from Nazareth. That was his identity. But there was this prophecy that the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem. So both gospel writers had to get a family from Nazareth down to Bethlehem for the birth. Matthew suggests they were originally from Bethlehem. Luke uses a census, different solutions to the same problem. But here's where it gets really interesting. The census that Luke mentions, we can fact-check that because we have other historical records. There was a Jewish historian named Josephus, or Josephus, pick your pronunciation, who wrote extensively about this era, and he specifically mentions this census. According to him, that census happened in 6 AD, and we know when Herod the Great died because that's well documented in Roman history. He died in the spring of 4 BC. That's a 10-year gap. If Jesus was born during Herod's reign, which Matthew says he was, and Herod died in 4 BC, then Jesus had to be born before 4 BC. Matthew's story requires at least a few months between the birth and Herod's death to fit all the events. So scholars usually put the birth somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC. But Luke says Jesus was born during the census, which happened in 6 AD, a decade later. For over a century, scholars have said that Luke got it wrong. He knew about this famous Roman census and used it to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. But he got the date wrong by 10 years. Luke's timeline doesn't work. So when was Jesus actually born? Best guess, based on Herod's death being the most solid anchor point we have, is somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC. Which brings us to another fun fact. December 25th has absolutely nothing to do when Jesus was actually born. Many of us know that. We have no idea what day or even what season he was born. The Gospels don't mention it, and none of the early Christian writers knew either. In the 3rd century, some were guessing it was in the spring. So where did December 25th come from? There are two theories. The first is what you've probably heard. Christians supposedly stole the date from pagan Roman festivals. Romans celebrated the winter solstice, and there was a cult of Sol Invictus with a feast on December 25th. The theory is Christians chose that date to override the pagan celebration. But that explanation doesn't show up until the 1200s, and early Christians in the 200s and 300s were being persecuted. They were avoiding pagan practices. It seems unlikely they'd borrow such an obvious pagan date. The other theory is more interesting. Early Christian theologians thought important religious figures were conceived and died on the same day. By 200 AD, they'd calculated Jesus died on March 25th in the Roman calendar, so they decided he must have been conceived on March 25th too. Do the math. Conceived March 25th, 9 months later, born December 25th. That's how they got the date. It was about sacred symmetry in Jesus' life. Now, let's talk about the Star of Bethlehem, because this is where astronomy meets theology in weird ways. The star only appears in Matthew's Gospel. Luke doesn't mention it at all. In Matthew, it appears to the Magi in the east. They follow it to Jerusalem, and then it moves ahead of them and stops over the exact house where Jesus is. That's pretty miraculous behavior for a celestial object. A lot of modern scholars think the star is a literary device. Its job is to fulfill this prophecy from the book of Numbers about a star coming out of Jacob, and to show that even Gentile wise men recognize Jesus as the Messiah. The fact that it moves around and stops over a specific building suggests it's meant to be understood as supernatural. But astronomers have tried to figure out if anything real could have inspired it. In 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn had this series of conjunctions where they appeared really close together in the sky. Kepler originally proposed this as the star, but the conjunctions weren't that visually dramatic. The more interesting option is that something happened in 6 BC. There was a double occultation where the moon passed in front of Jupiter twice, in March and April. This wouldn't have been a brilliant light show that everyone can see, but to ancient astrologers like the Magi, it would have been hugely significant. Jupiter was the king planet, and the occultation happened in Aries, which was associated with Judea in ancient astrology. So from their perspective, this was the sky announcing the birth of a king in Judea. There's this other astronomical scenario with Jupiter and Venus and conjunctions happening in 3 BC and 2 BC, culminating with Jupiter going stationary over Bethlehem on December 25th, 2 BC. It's a beautiful theory. There's just one problem. Herod died in 4 BC, so this is happening 2 years too late. The Star of Bethlehem is this perfect example of where science and faith collide. If you want it to be a real astronomical event, you have subtle things like the occultation that fits in the dates, but weren't miraculous. If you want it to be miraculous, like Matthew describes, then it can't be explained naturally. Which is fine because, as Christians, we're supposed to have faith and believe in the supernatural. And one more thing. There was this theory that Jesus was actually born in a different Bethlehem. There's a Bethlehem in Galilee, only about 7 kilometers from Nazareth. An archaeologist named Avram Oshri proposed this in early 2000s. His argument was that it made way more sense geographically. Why would a heavily pregnant woman travel 150 kilometers when there was a Bethlehem practically next door? Plus, he initially claimed the Bethlehem of Judea wasn't even inhabited in the 1st century. That last part turned out to be wrong. More recent archaeological excavations in Bethlehem of Judea found tons of pottery and artifacts from the 1st century. The town was definitely there, and people were definitely living in it. The traditional site even has caves underneath the Church of the Nativity that were being used in the 1st century. So the traditional Bethlehem checks out archaeologically. Here's what we're left with. The most historical probable scenario is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea sometime between 6 BC and 4 BC. We can't know the exact day or season, and December 25th is a later calculation based on Christian theology, not historical memory. The 2 gospel accounts contradict each other in ways that can't be harmonized. Luke's census is chronologically wrong by about a decade, and the Star of Bethlehem was either a subtle astronomical event that most people wouldn't have noticed, or it was meant to be understood as a miracle. What's fascinating is that it shows how much the gospel writers were willing to reshape historical details to make sure the theological message landed correctly. Jesus had to be from Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy, even though everyone knew he was really from Nazareth. So they found different ways to make that work. The birth of Jesus is one of the most scrutinized events in human history. And after 2,000 years of people analyzing every word of these texts, we still can't answer basic questions like what year it happened, or how two different gospel writers came up with two completely incompatible stories. That's a genuine mystery right there.